Hello and welcome back to Data Privacy. I'm your professor, Leopold Ludeman. This is first semester, or segment 1, what I've termed, and this is section 2 of segment 1, Fair Information Practices. This is going to be, at least in my opinion, now it's going to start getting very interesting. This is modern data privacy, electronic data collection, and everything that we've been thinking about when we think of data privacy now. But before we get there, let's make sure we understood what we did last week to really start our foundation. As you remember, last time we met, we talked about the history and introduction of privacy law. So, given the Bill of Rights, which was one of our foundations of privacy law, and the right of privacy and freedom, and the right to be left alone, was couched and written several hundred years ago. I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but what we're looking at is things like eavesdropping, the right to have your private home without having soldiers quartered in it. And really, if you think about it, it boils down to something written in the 1800s by Justice Brandeis of the right to be left alone and secure in your persons and property. These next two lectures will get into a lot more of that, and you'll see how that really sets the stage for everything else that we'll be doing. So let's dive into it, shall we? Fair information practices. Sounds really vague, doesn't it? But what I want you to see, as you've seen in the reading, is this sets the foundation for everything else we'll be doing. Here are some of the core principles. Now, from several hundred years ago to the 1970s, a huge jump in time. Let's look at these 5 original principles, and you can see in the readings, in 1973, we had the U.S. government report. That was the HUE report. That was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare went through and drafted this about the same time that a committee was doing it in Great Britain, the Younger report. So, let's look at each of these, and you will see that they continue to get updated up through, I think the materials that I've given you are through the Obama administration, and all sorts of permutations. But each of these points is very important, and you'll see these carry on through. Now, when I say this, these seem like a great goal, and might seem like initially enough to be a privacy policy. As it is, things have progressed in the last 50 years, so you can see that we need to add on to it, but these things continue to live on today, and once you get a feel for this language, you'll see that it continues through everything we'll be doing. So, let's look at the first bullet point. What I'm going to do is go through, you can follow through with your reading materials, or just listen to me and take notes, whichever is easiest for you. But I want to discuss each of these a little more, and we'll have a question and answers period afterwards, because I really think this is important to grasp, and I want you to get a good handle on it. So, there must be no personal data record-keeping systems whose very existence is secret. What this is saying is that, well, let's back up a little bit. The key word here is, even though it doesn't say this, is transparency. So, when data is collected from a person, the overall idea, before we get into that, is what is collected, how it's collected, when it's collected, what is collected, how it's processed, how it's secured, and how it's stored. Everything you can think about data. Having said that, let's now start looking at those questions, not individually, but each of these bullet points, to really help you get a grasp on what we're talking about. First, there must be no personal data record-keeping systems whose very existence is secret. Why is this important? And I'm going to ask this for each of the bullet points. If the goal is to be transparent, that's clear. That's the opposite of secret. But why transparent? If personal information is very private or potentially damaging to people, it's their information, their property right. Now, as we go through, the government collects a lot of different information for your driver's license, for your tax records, health information, for example, transmittable diseases with COVID-19. We have to keep that secret, but the government wants to know who has COVID-19 and how it's spreading. So, that's just an example. There's the balance. If it's secret, there's no accountability. Specifically, with the right to privacy, people have a right, therefore, to know where their information is going, what they're collecting, and more modernly, the right to not only correct that if it's wrong, review it, and sometimes even ask for it to be deleted. None of that is going to be possible if the record-keeping systems are secret. Next point. There must be a way for an individual to find out what information about him is in a record and how it is used. Why is this important? So if it's not secret, they say, yes, we have your information. There are some types of information that we understand. If I go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, it's important they know where I live, how old I am to make sure I have a license to drive, and also what cars are registered. Easy enough. If my car is stolen, I want them to know that I'm not in possession of it, in case there's something that happens with it. That's okay, and we're fine with that information being kept. But other information they may glean, not necessarily DMV, but just think in general terms, that we don't want them to know, and they really don't have any business knowing, and they don't have any need for it. We'll get into that, Paul. All of these things are very big picture, so just keep that in mind. We're going to open these up and tear them apart and really get into the nitty-gritty. Right now, I don't want you, and I will not get lost in the weeds, seeing all the different paths we can go down to these fundamental principles. I just want you to focus on this and get a feel for what we're dealing with. Third point, following what I just talked about with knowing what information is a record and how it's used, now we need to know if they take more than what's contained in the record and how it's used. There needs to be a way for a person or individual to prevent that information about being obtained. And if it's not only being obtained, but maybe it's okay to be obtained for one reason, but not another. So there must be ways to prevent this. A lot of it has to do now with transparency, disclosure, and knowing where the systems are. You can see each of these build on each other. The fourth point, there must be a way for an individual to correct or amend the record identifiable information about himself. The fifth point, again building on the last. It's not secret, so they know there's records collected. Second point, they know what's in the records and where they're kept. Third point, they know what it's being used for, what it's obtained, and also what purposes, therefore, they've consented to using their information and what they haven't consented to their information. And now then, supposing they've consented and it's okay to use that specific information for a purpose, but it's wrong. It could have detrimental effects. So the fourth point is there must be a way for an individual to amend the record, make sure it's accurate. There's reasons for this. It could have detrimental effects. Sometimes too, if the individual wants to go through there, or they change it, or whoever's using that personal data wants to use it for something else in line with a business, not exactly what they used it for, but assumedly and related to such that we would normally say it's okay, they might want to contact the individual and let them know, or send out more information that may be of interest to them, especially if the individual consented it. There's several reasons why the record should be accurate. The fifth point, this is the security. now that we have the data of an individual, they know what it's used for, it's correct, this needs to be secure. And this last point is simply, and this seems to be a no-brainer, once they have the information, it's secure. You can see I've just forwarded on to the next slide. I didn't list the bullet points, but if you want, follow along on page 10 of your reading materials. And before I dive into that, I will repeat. You will see these FIPs, Fair Information Principles, somewhat repeated. As you go through these, and I'm sure as you read through them, you'll see it seems somewhat repetitious. It is. You're right. Here's why, though, I pinpointed there's this one and one other I'm going to show you for specific reasons. But as you go through, I think it's important to read different ways that these have been written and see how it's evolved, because it's really going to give you a good feel for, in my opinion, the fundamentals of data privacy. So, having said that, let's go into the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They expanded, if you remember, the last slide, you can see there are 5 points. That was in 73. In 1980, we went through and expanded, or the OECD went through and expanded into 8 points. They're phrased differently, but you'll start recognizing how they've expanded out and updated it within 7-8 years. So let's look at those on page 10. The first one, collection limitation principle. So it didn't specifically list this before, but this is very simple and maybe one of the easiest of these 8 points to understand. Basically, only collect what you need. Don't collect more. This has to go to the fundamental of privacy. If that individual or entity whose data we're collecting has a right and they own it to respect their privacy, we're only going to gather that information that we need to use for whatever the purpose is. Makes sense, right? Not only is that individual's privacy respected, but also on the flip side, it's less information and more efficient to make sure it's secure. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Point 2, data quality principle. Not only is the entity collecting the data and controlling it, should they limit to what they collect, to specific what they need, they also need to make sure that the purpose for which the data they collect for that specific purpose is accurate, is up to date, and complete. This ensures that not only do they have and can deliver the service or information that they owe the individual, but also make sure the individual isn't harmed with incomplete or incorrect data. We'll get into that later. Point 3, purpose specification principle. So, this means that when they collect what data they need that is accurate, they specify exactly why they're collecting it at the time they collect it, if not before. So ideally before, so the person can give consent as to what they're collecting, or at least relevant to what they would be collecting it for. The flip side of that is it shouldn't be incompatible with the consent given by the individual. So not only would that be more data than is necessary, but also using it for what they don't consent to. Point 4. Oh, and as I'm reading these in our question and answer period at the end of class, make notes if you have any questions on these, or anything else in the reading material for that matter. Point 4. Use limitation principle. So, we've limited what we're collecting. We've made sure it's accurate. We're collecting it only for the specific purpose that it needs. So, and what I alluded to at the last is they limit the use to what they've collected it for. If there is another use that might be of interest to the individual, or that is interest to the data controller and the entity that collected it, they really need to gain that consent of the person who owns their data before they should use it or not. It goes right back up to purpose specification principle, but again, kind of circular to make sure that their data, and it's not an invasion of privacy, but make sure their data is used correctly. Security safeguard principles, again, this is very easy to understand. Once the data is collected, accurate, and limited with consent, it's held secure. That's it. Easy for security, right? Next point, openness principle. This is also fairly self-explanatory. So the organization should have a general policy of openness about developments, practices, and policies with respect to personal data. So the way they collect the personal data, what their use, should be open, and again, we go to the word that you'll hear all the time, transparent. Next point, individual participation principle. This has to do with the individuals. Now, we have the entity who's collecting the individual's data, but what power does that individual have once they give it? Well, here it is. This is the right of the individual to request from the entity who collected the data to see what they collected. If it's wrong, correct it. Request a copy to see what they have. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll get it. If it's very expensive, or say they request it once a week, every week, for the last 30 weeks, you know, there are limitations, but they do have a right to get it, but there are exceptions, and that's outlined in that individual participation principle, and you'll see it throughout the rest of the document. Again, and then the last one, accountability principle. None of this is any good if nobody's there to enforce it. I'm just going to go through and skip ahead a little bit to page 28. This isn't on a slide. And this is much more recent than the 80s. Fast forward 30, 40 years into the Department of Commerce, February 2012. And this is, you'll see again, and now this should start ringing familiar to you again, since you've already read it. Let's just go through a few of these. Individual control. This is number 1 on page 28. And you'll see it bolded there in caps. Consumers have the right to exercise control over what their personal data companies collect for them and how they use it. Sound familiar? Transparency. This means that they have a right to easily understand and access the information that's been collected, and also know what security practices have been put in. Now, when we look at individual control of requesting information, and that's participation that we just covered, right? And then 2, transparency, to see what's collected and how it's protected. They're different words, but do you see the familiarity? Let's go forward. And this is just an example. Respect for context. They have the right to see what companies will be collecting, what they will be using it for, etc. Security. I think that was the same word we used before with how it's being secured, etc., etc. So if you have any questions, let's go through that. You will see, and really, in summary, what I want you to do is, again, I'm going to ask those questions I started with ahead. Let's look at the data. We're pulling in personal data, some of it very private and secret, that nobody wants anybody else to know, but somehow, or for whatever reason, they're either willingly or without knowing going to put it out there, whether they are at the doctor's and give very secret personal health information for treatment, or they put something nobody else, they don't want the general public to know, for whatever reason they put it on social media, and the social media companies gather it, or even any of these other machine-to-machine communications, which is included in here. All that data is being collected. Having said that, the right to know what's being collected, what it's used for, limiting only what is needed and what's used, and to make sure that it's accurate, right? How do we do that? We need accountability to hold whoever's collecting it accountable. Otherwise, they can do whatever they want, theoretically. The other thing, too, is the individual whose data is needs to be able to go in and make sure that it is accurate and that they're using it for what they use it for. And if they change their mind or they no longer need it, we'll get into this later, but they should be able the right to pull it and to make sure that the organization has only kept it for so long as they need it. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but you're getting the idea of where these more modern concepts, such as you may have heard the right to be forgotten, come from. Look at what they're collecting, how they're collecting it, how they're using it, how they're securing it. That's all for part 2 of section 1.